Hello and welcome to Cover Story. Today I have with me Manish Tewari. He's a former Union Minister and a Congress Lok Sabha MP. But also Manish is out with his fifth book. It's a very well-timed book, A World Adrift, A Parliamentarian's Perspective on Global Power Dynamics. In fact, given the current adrift times, so to speak, I think Manish, your book could not have been better timed. At the launch also, I believe there was someone asked if whether you'd done a backdoor deal with Donald Trump really in order to sell your book. So tell us, what is your deal with Donald Trump? And what made how long have you been working on this book?
Well, first of all, I wish there was a deal with Donald Trump, but that is not the case. However, my term as a distinguished senior fellow with the Atlantic Council, which is based in Washington, D.C., overlapped with President Donald Trump's first term in office. And one thing became very evident that America, exhausted after two wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan, was desperately wanting to disengage. And it became fairly clear to me that there would be a huge power vacuum which will open up if the US decides to retreat from its global commitments.
Hmm.
And then COVID 19 happened, and President Biden became president. And President Biden obviously had a more sophisticated internationalist view of global affairs. And that's what continued till 2024. And then
Hmm.
President Donald Trump's second term, the past 1 year, has been chaotic to say the least. But the signs were very evident way back in 2016 itself that fundamentally the United States is unwilling to shoulder the burden of being the single biggest outside balancer of power.
So Manish, basically the whole thing, the US has decided, you said it's exhausted. It doesn't want to play the role of global policeman, but it's also playing the role of global disruptor. I mean, he's going out of his way also, whether it is in Venezuela, his actions again, his threatening Greenland. So Trump is being more of a disruptor than, is the gamekeeper turned poacher, so to speak.
Well, I think you make a very relevant point, Priya. And before I answer that question, there are five overarching themes in this
Hmm.
book. You see, the first theme in the book is that if at all there was a rules based order which got created post the Second World War, then effectively it is over. The second big theme in the book is the not the rise of China, but at the
Hmm.
relentless pace with which China is rising. And India would complete 100 years of independence in 1947, and
Right.
in 2047,
Right.
China would do that in 2049. But by then, the gap between India and China would have widened so much that it would not even be possible to play catch up. And that's
Hmm.
something which India needs to very, very seriously apply itself to. The third overarching theme in the book is that given the kind of external environment that we confront, social cohesion is our biggest antidote to preserve our national security.
Right.
Religious polarization for electoral benefit and the way it has been done in the past 10 or 11 years has stretched our social fabric taut, and
Hmm.
that does not augur well for India's national security. Number four, there is a revolution in military affairs. Even the kinetic actions between India and Pakistan in the May of 2025 demonstrated that the whole uh, conflict was about
Yes.
drones and the
Hmm.
use of kinetic air power than any ground movement of forces. So you cannot fight the battles of the future with
Hmm.
the weapons of the past. You have to heavily invest in the emerged technologies, artificial intelligence, cognitive warfare, and intelligence-ized battlefield, because otherwise you will just not be able to compete. And the fifth, which brings me to
Hmm.
your question, is what happens with the power vacuum in the world. And you're right. So therefore, there are two contradictory impulses that we are seeing in President Donald Trump's third term.
Hmm.
Second, the first, of course, is that America wanting to retreat back into the Americas. And number two, this very acquisitive impulse. What happened in Venezuela. You've decapitated a regime, you've spirited away a sitting president to a
Hmm.
prison in New York. Then your advances on Greenland, the board of the global board of trustees, which President Donald Trump wants to conceptualize to oversee the reconstruction of Gaza, and a lot of people who never would take whatever President Donald Trump was saying, and he was saying all this during his first term also. But
Yeah.
it was difficult, perhaps, for him to untangle his administration from the web of global commitments that the US had very assiduously created post the Second
Hmm.
World War. And so people are waking up to the reality that this man is not just shooting the breeze. He actually, for whatever or howsoever outrageous it might be, means what he says. And that's a very hard lesson which the world is learning.
That is true. And in fact, and we are trying to figure out as to, now who will replace Donald Trump also, because you also talk about, you said that, the things are moving at a very fast pace. If, for instance, he acts against Greenland, will that then have an impact on how NATO is constructed, or will, to how NATO will react? We'll see how we handle Donald Trump. So who will now, take the place of US?
Well, that's the litmus test for Europe. Will Europe hold the line on Greenland,
Hmm.
irrespective of whatever is the strategic cost which the Europeans have to bear? And the Europeans are really in a cleft stick. So on the eastern flank, they have Russia,
Hmm.
which is not giving up on Ukraine, irrespective of the international opprobrium it has been subject to in the past 3 years or 4 years since the war started. Is we forget as to how quickly time moves. February 2026 will be 4 years since the conflict started, and then on the western flank, you have the United States, which
Hmm.
is pressing on Greenland. At times one wonders whether President Putin and President Trump are playing tango together, and the Europeans are really getting crushed in the whole process. But it is critical for Europe, and the Europeans have also now very rudely woken up to the fact that you cannot outsource your security to anyone else. Post the Second World War, Europe had
Hmm.
effectively outsourced its security to the United
Right.
States. And now the United States wants to claim a price for that. And the price today is Greenland. Tomorrow, the price could be something else. So, therefore, the whole world is watching very carefully as to how the Europeans are
Hmm.
able to handle President Trump's acquisitive aspirations, quake Greenland, irrespective of whatever he says with regard
Hmm.
to US national security or European security for that matter. You cannot just walk into a sovereign country. I mean,
Hmm.
Greenland is a semi-autonomous territory of the Kingdom of Denmark, and that's been the case for the past 500 years.
Hmm.
So therefore, in many senses of the word, you are back to the Yankee imperialism of the early 20th century, which essentially is premised upon what Cardinal Richelieu had said
Hmm.
in the 17th century, with which I begin my book, that nations act on the basis of raison d'etre, their
Hmm.
best national interest. And therefore, if the US continues to act like this, then as Hugo Grotius had said, you are
Hmm.
then back to again another 17th century concept, the balance of power. Now, how
Right.
the balance of power would be constructed to constrain both an aggressive US on one hand
Hmm.
and a very aggressive China which has been on a very different trajectory since 2012, and a Russia which, despite being uh, compared to the US and China, a relatively minor economic power,
Hmm.
continues to be militarily aggressive. So therefore, we are really in unprecedented times. After 1945, this is
Hmm.
for the first time that you see four concurrent conflicts playing themselves
Same
out.
time.
And
That's
effectively, the United Nations, which was supposed to keep the peace after two very destructive world wars, which cost 1 billion lives, and
hmm.
saw the destructive use of the atom, saw entire nations being destroyed,
Wiped out.
that effectively has become redundant.
In fact, yeah, that's what you very aptly call it. Are we living in an age of monsters? And I think this is exactly what is happening. The old order, as you pointed out, post World War II, is been dismantled, and the new order is yet to be formed. How will it be conceived? Who will be heading it? In fact, I would also like to, I know you're very fond of Yeats, also another 20th century poet, and he talks about how things are falling apart when the center cannot hold. We are heading towards that second coming, and I just wonder, what monster, what is awaiting us really. So how do you see this playing out? As you said, there are four conflicts going on. There is no, or will it be a transactional solution that, you take Greenland, I will take Taiwan? Is there going to be that kind of a, it's very easily said, but that kind of a balance sheet, are we looking towards that kind of a solution?
And then where would this end? Would then China take Taiwan? So therefore, where does that leave the middle pass? Where does that leave India? Where
And
does that?
that's what you write in your book, what India should do. In fact, that's
Yeah,
what I want to talk.
yeah. So where does that leave the middle pass? Where does that leave Europe? Where does that leave large parts of Africa? And that's why I have said in my book, look, we have two strategic continuums. One is non-alignment, which is now called multi-alignment, right? In fact, this is exactly what the situation was post the Second World War. Immediately after the Second World War ended, the Cold War commenced. And
Hmm.
large parts of Asia, Africa, Latin America, South America, which were liberating themselves from the yoke of imperialism and colonialism, were looking
Hmm.
for a third way. And number two is self reliance, which is now called Atmanirbharta. That when the bloc politics started squeezing countries like India,
Hmm.
you decided that self reliance is the only way to preserve and protect your sovereignty. And I don't think that we should hesitate or we should be ashamed of these strategic continuums primarily because it doesn't suit a political purpose. The reality is, uh, what does multi-alignment means? It means
Hmm.
India will engage with everybody in its own best interest. What does Atmanirbharta mean? That we will be self-reliant enough so that our strategic space and our strategic autonomy can be protected. So I think there is a need to really strengthen these two concepts, and India should rejuvenate its leadership of the global South.
I'm going to, in fact, come on this. And your chapter is very enticingly entitled, I think, Dance with the Neighbors, if I'm not wrong, on India's reaction with the neighbors. After a quick break, and let's, keep the conversation going. So stay with us. Hello and welcome back to a cover story conversation. I have with me Manish Tewari, former Union Minister and Congress MP, who's come out with his latest book, A World Adrift. And in fact, he talks about the times we live in and the disruptions that Donald Trump has brought in. But then, how should India react? Before the break, we were talking about that in terms of whether it's reactions with its neighbors or talking to China as well as negotiating with the US. We have to, as you said, look after our own national interests, and that's what Atmanirbharta is really all about, as you pointed out, Manish.
Well, Priya, I recount a parliament question at the beginning of the chapter on neighbors. I
Hmm.
had asked Minister Jaishankar. I said, look, India has a neighborhood policy, for a neighborhood first policy. And it's
Right.
not a policy which was only conceptualized by this government. I mean, going back to the times of even Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, or even beyond, before that, to Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, we've always tried to prioritize the neighborhood. But then, which of India's neighbors has really had an India first policy? And
That's true.
of course, he thought that I was trying to be critical of the current government, which was not my intention even then. And so he replied in a very injured tone that if you want to run down the foreign policy of the government, that is your
Hmm.
prerogative. But that was not the intent, and that's
Right.
why the whole chapter on neighbors looks at our relationship with each of our neighbors very closely without an ideological lens. And so, therefore, two things come out very clearly. You see, either we need to find a modus vivendi with our neighbors, which includes China,
Hmm.
which includes the rest of our neighbors, and which at some point in time will also have to include Pakistan, which of course cannot be the case today, given its the kind of belligerence it has, or we
Right.
will have to substantially ramp up our national security expenditure. You cannot have a situation where you exist in a state of perennial tension in your neighborhood
Hmm.
and your national security spends then do not match the tactical or strategic posture that you have adopted with your neighbors. So, I mean, look at the situation today.
But
Pakistan.
it takes two to tango. So Pakistan is not ready to dance. So we have no options but to ramp up our national security, right?
So therefore, then on the other side, then you have to find a modus vivendi. See, you have tensions on your western border, and as I have pointed out in my book,
Hmm.
Pakistan is the ultimate rogue state when it comes to it, because for the last 4.5 decades, going back, or 6 decades going back to 1971, when we liberated East Pakistan and created Bangladesh, the revanchist desire for revenge is what really dictates Pakistan's policy qua India. But today,
Correct.
you have a situation whereby the country you cleaved into half to liberate the people on the eastern side are today not very well disposed to you either. So
Hmm.
you are in a state of tension with Pakistan on the western border, with Bangladesh on the eastern border, which you midwifed into existence. I mean, late Prime Minister Mrs. Gandhi changed the political map of South Asia in
Correct.
1971, 21 years, 25 years after independence to create Bangladesh. I mean, you cannot wish away that reality. And then you have China, where
Hmm.
you have been in a state of frozen turbulence going all the way
Hmm.
back to 1960, even before the 1962 war. In fact, going back further to the Chinese occupation of Tibet, that is when the whole thing started. So that's why I say that whether you look east, you look west, you look down south, where the Chinese influence in Sri Lanka and Maldives, in your neighborhood, has been growing over the past decade and a half. India really needs to go back to the drawing board and see as to what it can substantively give its neighbors and what it can get in return. So, if South Asia is our eminent domain, if that is our version of the Monroe Doctrine, then I think where we should seriously evaluate where are we, where are neighbors today.
And that evaluation, as you point out, should not be done in a partisan manner. There should be, everybody one response that India should have, which you've been arguing for a while now, in fact.
In fact, as I said, that there are strategic continuums in India's foreign policy, in India's strategic culture, and on certain basic things, because they have to be on a long-term trajectory. There has to
Hmm.
be a broad political consensus across the spectrum that this is what we will need to do, or this is the way forward quay our neighborhood over, let's say, the next 25 years. And we have a template. You see, the economic liberalization of 1991 has held till now. There have been minor adjustments here and there, but
Hmm.
the broad framework of 1991's economic liberalization and globalization is something which is a tribute to India's political class, that we are able to maintain broad continuity in our economic trajectory or in our economic philosophy. And the same thing needs to be done with regard to our foreign policy, because the challenges that we confront and
Hmm.
the technological evolution which has taken place or is taking place, requires that continuity.
Which is, also regarding the way we have, our actions towards China versus our negotiating with the US, but we also now there's a reach out towards China, our stand on the Ukraine war. So, how do you see India's foreign policy in the last 2, 3 years?
Well, what I really see is an endeavor to somehow maintain strategic autonomy in a world where there is pressure from all sides. You are trying to maintain the strategic space that you have, and it is reflected in the paradox qua China. So while you have had this border standoff for 4 years, and even the disengagements which have taken place, I mean, the full picture with regard to those disengagements is still not out in the public space. Will the buffer zones become permanent? How many patrolling points were we accessing before April, May 2020? Are we able to access all those patrolling points now? Has the stated government position that they would want to restore status quo ante as of April, May 2020, has that been achieved or not? There is absolutely no clarity on that. And then the paradox is that while you had this border standoff,
Hmm.
your trade with China kept growing every year. Today,
Correct.
you have your largest trade deficit, Kuwait China. In fact, it is very close to the US when it comes to being the number one trading partner. And
Hmm.
then, of course, you have the relationship with Russia, which has been a defense relationship now after the Soviet Union collapsed
Hmm.
and Russia emerged as the successor state. And then also you have now the Russian Chinese relationship, which is even better than what it was during the Cold War. And
Correct.
therefore, your principal defense partner is also the closest strategic ally of a neighbor with whom you've been in frozen turbulence since 1959 or 56, 57. And then, of course, you have the situation with the United States, which, in many senses of the word, is portentous. That you are almost back to 1979, when the ducks and drakes of the United States, China, and Pakistan were aligned when it
Hmm.
came to the US, the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. So therefore, uh, and then India does not have the luxury of having the Soviet Union as a backstop.
Anymore.
So we
That.
are really in unprecedented times, and that's why I say that on certain broad fundamental parameters, we need continuity, at least over the next 25 years, which, according to me, should be the space for us to internally consolidate ourselves also. You can only
It.
punch to your weight when
Hmm.
you are internally cohesive and you have been able to surmount the challenges of your human development internally. So rather than having any delusions about yourself, we need to see the reality. We need to comprehend the situation around
Hmm.
us, and we need to see that by the time we turn 100, we are internally a much more cohesive nation and have much better parameters of fundamental human development.
In fact, I think at your launch, the former External Affairs Minister Yashwant Sinha called you a scholar parliamentarian, and I think today's conversation and your book really is a testimony to that fact. I do hope the powers that are will listen to you in this, because we do need a united, cohesive response, because these are really turbulent times, as you pointed out. Thank you so much, Manish Tiwari, for this conversation, and congratulations on your book. Thank you.
Thank you, Priya, for your kind words and a quiet conversation, which is very rare in the
Thank
turbulent times that we live in. Thank you very much.
Thank you.